Our next speaker is Dana Ward. Dana is a professor of political studies at Pissarro College in California and the founder of the Anarchist Archives, which is an online research center for the history and theory of anarchism. He has been through that program, been digitizing with his students anarchist texts, ephemera, graphic material of all kinds, until the archives has become the largest such archives in the world, an enormous research facility. His talk today is called Anarchist Culture on the Cusp of the 20th Century. Dana?
Before I start, I have to take this opportunity to confront one of the comments that was made in the opening remarks. And while it's true that anarchy is difficult to define, it can be individualist, it can be collectivist, mutualist, communist, syndicalist, indeed even religious. One thing it is not is nihilist, and consequently, I would not include the Unabomber as an anarchist. He was a nihilist, not an anarchist. In any event, if you want to find out more about anarchy, I urge you to go to Anarchy Archives. The URL is anarchyarchives.org. And once you're there, you'll see that organization and anarchy are by no means an oxymoron. Anyway, always adopting a skeptical attitude towards political parties and political paths to change, anarchists politicized every other aspect of life. Economics, education, sex, diet, publishing, music, architecture, the arts, and much else were subjected not simply to intellectual critique, but also faced concrete challenges posed by the developing anarchist aesthetic to the reigning orthodoxy in each field. Anarchists saw themselves as culture builders. They saw themselves challenging the existing circumstances and offering an alternative in which free expression, autonomy, and horizontal social relations could be practiced. Now, since traditional party politics were anathema to anarchists, if the ideal was to spread, they would need spaces, free spaces for the nurturing of the ideal. And although journals and newspapers and books were major foci of their efforts, creating a space for the practice of anarchy was necessary for the successful spread of the ideal. If individuals were going to celebrate individual creativity and social responsibility, they needed a social context, a space. And while reading anarchist tracts might produce adherence to the ideal, a far more powerful impact could be produced by immersing oneself in a web of horizontal social relations. The actual practice involved in organizing a choir, putting on a lecture or publishing a journal, producing flyers, teaching workers to read, or children to read. This allowed anarchists to see themselves in the movement, to experience social solidarity, and provided the satisfaction of actually seeing their ideas put into action, and in the process, anarchist identities solidified. Now, anarchists avidly engaged in producing a counterculture long before the term gained currency. The motivating idea was to create a society from within the shell of the old by creating institutions and social networks based on free association and non-hierarchical relations. The emerging new society would either come to the fore after the revolution, providing the seed from which the new society would blossom, or gradually the new autonomous institutions would push the older forms to the side. And many of the major early anarchist theorists were among those who were drawn to building concrete examples, concrete challenges to existing relations. And these include, for example, Josiah Warren with the Cincinnati Times Store, Pierre Joseph Proudhon's efforts to create the People's Bank, the Reclus brothers' participation in producer cooperatives, the Chicago anarchist choirs, the French anarchist who animated the Workers' Theater, Francisco Ferrer's Modern School with its many replications in Europe and the United States, or Barcelona's Ateneos. These were anarchist cultural centers that formed the foundation, really, for solidifying working class culture and were crucial to the success of the Spanish Revolution that took place during the Spanish Civil War, which is one of the two instances where anarchy actually has been achieved in practice. If you look at particularly in Barcelona, Aragon, Catalonia during the Spanish Civil War, you'll see anarchism in practice. The other time when anarchism was actually practiced was after the Russian Revolution. In the aftermath in the Ukraine, the Makhdamite Revolution put into practice anarchist principles. In any event, while labor agitation may have been at the forefront of anarchist activism, many anarchists, wherever anarchists congregated, and there were sufficient numbers for an audience and an ensemble, some form of cultural production would ensue. This might include theater productions, poetry readings, dances, choirs, art exhibitions, parades, and of course their infamous picnics where almost all of those activities might take place. But the beer halls and the cafes, this was the core of anarchist culture. The beer halls and cafes that became the magnets for anarchists soon expanded to include lecture halls and stages. Very importantly, many of these bars and cafes added stages as they prospered. So along with consuming copious amounts of beer and coffee, one could simultaneously absorb an education that included not just social and economic doctrines, but included all the creative arts. Since traditional party, and this was where many people learned their politics in the context of social discussion about art and poetry and novels. Now, states fully realized that blunting anarchism's impact on society required the restriction of anarchist space. Indeed, much of the history of anarchist-state relations is the history of states' efforts to eliminate public spaces where isolated individuals could discover like-minded associates and form a nucleus of resistance. Throughout much of the middle of the 19th century, for example, it was illegal for more than 3 people to congregate on the streets of France. By the end of the century, in many countries, it was illegal simply to be an anarchist. For example, there was no attempt whatsoever made to link the Chicago anarchists to the Haymarket bombing. They were tried simply for being anarchists, and 5 of them lost their life as a consequence. And likewise in France, during the trial of the 30 in 1894, most of the defendants were guilty of breaking no law other than being an anarchist and associating with anarchists. Now, while the anarchist writers and the press were primary targets of state repression, equal efforts were expended pressuring landlords to restrict anarchist access to meeting spaces and living accommodations, and likewise, known anarchists were placed on employers' blacklists. In many cities, transformed public spaces by building armories for troops. We see this all over the east of the United States, those big armories that you find in the middle of many cities. They were there to house the troops that would go out and suppress strikes. Some cities engaged in wholesale urban removal plans to make building barricades during civil unrest more difficult. And entire neighborhoods in Paris and in Barcelona, for example, were razed, streets were widened, workers were moved to the periphery of the city in efforts to restrict the space available for anarchist activity. In short, the history of anarchist-state relations is very much a history of the expansion and contraction of anarchist spaces. And this struggle continues to this day. Recently in New York City, for example, police fabricated evidence to convict anarchists of engaging in such dangerous activities as riding bicycles together on public streets. And elsewhere throughout the United States, members of Food Not Bombs are arrested and jailed for passing out free food to the homeless in public spaces. This is going on throughout the United States today. The importance of anarchist space to the success of the movement can be seen in the oft-told anecdote of Emma Goldman's first day in New York City. Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were the 2 most important American anarchists, and they met on the day that I'm about to describe. Goldman had been moved by the injustice perpetrated upon the Haymarket martyrs and decided to devote her life to the cause. And she uprooted herself from Rochester during the summer of 1889, arriving in New York City, bearing little more than a sewing machine and a suitcase. She had 3 addresses, though. One was for her aunt, one was for an anarchist worker that she had met in New Haven when she was working in a corset factory, and the 3rd address was the address for the office of Johann Most Freiheit, Johann Most was a German immigrant who was expelled from Germany, spent some time in England, and then ends up in the United States, and was the foremost anarchist at this particular time. So on Emma Goldman's first day, she located her acquaintance. He took her to dinner at Sachs Cafe on Suffolk Street, which was considered the headquarters of the East Side socialists, anarchists, and radicals. And there, Emma Goldman met two young workers, Anna and Helen Minkin, who immediately offered to share their apartment with her. And while chatting with the Minkins, Emma hears in a loud voice Alexander Berkman calling out for an extra steak and an extra cup of coffee. He had managed to get a couple bucks in his pocket. And by the end of the evening, Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman were seated side by side listening to a lecture by Johann Most. So this is her first day in New York. She finds a place to live, gets embedded in a network of anarchists, and is sitting there listening to the leader of the anarchist movement in New York at the time. Not a bad start for a young woman intent upon joining the anarchist movement. Well, anarchist cafes and bars provided the space for the creation of countless networks among the patrons, and these networks in turn produced spaces for the creation of still broader networks. For example, many years after Goldman and Berkman met at Sachs Cafe, they were involved in the foundation of the Modern School in New York, following up on Ferrer, the ideas of Francisco Ferrer. And the Modern School, in turn, drew participants from beyond the anarchist activist community, engaging prominent scholars and artists who otherwise might not have come into contact with the anarchist movement. People like Durant, the historians Will and Ariel Durant. In city after city and in country after country, similar spaces were being created, and perhaps nowhere more successfully during the last 2 decades of the 19th century than in Paris. There, artists, writers, poets, critics, agitators, and workers created an anarchist culture, much of which eventually seeped into the core of modernism. The two key French anarchists connecting artists and anarchists during the last 2 decades of the 19th century were, I always learned it as Grave because I'm an autodidact. I know it's Grave, and I'll probably say Grave all throughout the thing. But anyway, Jean Grave and Félix Fénéon. Grave edited Les Révoltés, which was started by Reclus and Kropotkin in Switzerland, and he took it over, and the name changed to La Révolte, and then eventually Les Temps Nouveaux. And he produced numerous books, plays, and articles. And Félix Fénéon was perhaps even more influential beyond the anarchist movement. He was without question the most important art critic in the 1890s. He was a prime mover in bringing Seurat to the attention of the world. He invented the term neo-impressionism. He edited the leading literary journal, perfected the novel in 3 lines genre, and may well have bombed a Parisian cafe in 1894. Both Grave and Fénéon were among those charged in the trial of the 30, and both were broadly connected throughout the Paris intellectual community in fin de siècle France. Together, their networks and friends and colleagues illustrate the importance of social networks for the proliferation of anarchist culture. While Grave corresponded with a broad array of anarchists, his correspondence with artists and writers was probably wider. Constantly looking for articles and illustrations for his journals and for other journals with which he was associated. He was constantly reaching out to avant-garde artists, asking them to make contributions. And he became a central node connecting anarchists with artists in the avant-garde network. Fénéon would become an equally important node, making the reverse connection between artists and anarchists. In 1880, Grave helped found the first significant anarchist group in Paris since the suppression of the Commune. This was the social study group of the 5th and 13th wards. At its meetings, Grave came into contact with the Italian anarchist exiles Malatesta and Caffiero, and with and another theme that I had included in the paper, but it became much too unwieldy, is the whole idea of the anarchist diaspora. When states start suppressing anarchism, anarchists are forced to leave. They carry with them their anarchism wherever they go, pick up some more ideas, and then eventually come back to their countries, and that's part of the process by which anarchist culture became disseminated and carried a wide variety of common characteristics across national boundaries. Anyway, he met Malatesta and Caffiero here, and he also came into contact with the leader of the Workers' Socialist Party in France. And here is where Grave began to form his network of friends and connections and political contacts. In Fénéon's case, he came to Paris after sitting for a civil service exam while he was still in the military. He passed it with the highest marks, and that assured him of a secure income upon completion of military service. Fénéon arrived in Paris in March of 1881 and took up his position in none other than the War Office. By 1883, Fénéon was contributing many articles to anarchist journals, publishing articles over the next 12 years in more than 20 publications, most of them symbolist, but many anarchist journals. Fénéon's first literary effort involved founding Libre Review, and they founded it literally in a noisy cafe by gathering together patrons in the cafe who each made their contributions and produced what was considered an attractive review reflecting beaux art taste. And from this point on, Fénéon became involved in a wide variety of groups in both the art and anarchy worlds. For example, every Monday night, he could be found at Café Voltaire, discussing art and politics, listening to poetry readings, debating literature, and there might be 30, 50 people sitting around listening to Fénéon, who they regarded as, quote, the most entertaining of all. On other nights, Fénéon could be found conversing with writers in the Latin Quarter. At one such table, over a 3-night period, Fénéon and 3 of the fellow patrons produced a highly regarded book of art criticism. In short, Café Society created a space for the development of anarchist thought and a network for its diffusion. Ancillary to the public gatherings were innumerable private soirees in residences where members of the art and anarchy network often met. For example, in 1886, Fénéon began regular Sunday get-togethers with artists and writers, either in their homes or in cafes, where frequently one could find Pissarro, Signac, Seurat seated with Grave and or Fénéon, and often accompanied by foreign visitors and exiles. Grave had an expansive view of art, which helps explain why artists were comfortable contributing to his journals. Anarchists were well aware that there was a new consciousness developing among artists, consciousness of social injustice, and consequently, anarchists opened their pages to artists. And artists, for their part, appreciated the anarchist receptivity to their work and offered their works for inclusion in the journal, joined the list of subscribers, provided public support for arrested anarchists, and opened their wallets to finance publishing efforts. Late in 1891, a group of writer militants established the short-lived journal L'Art Social, and this group leaned more towards art as propaganda than art for art's sake, and the works they produced weren't particularly impressive. But a few years later, after the journal's demise, the same group resurrected the journal, and this time they took a further step. And they organized a program to bring art to the masses. And this succeeded in organizing lectures and discussion groups and exhibitions in working-class neighborhoods across Paris. So they spread out and tried to create more spaces for the discussion and practice of anarchy. A contemporary writer described these meetings as, quote, long, philosophical, literary, and scientific discussions. It was, in a sense, the Academy of Anarchism. Well, this Academy of Anarchism was one of many such organizations that formed a network of anarchist artists and workers. And Grave used his considerable influence to recruit artists into this network who were willing to take up social themes in their art, to reveal the human condition, to stoke the spirit of revolt, or provide a vision of the anarchist future. And Pissarro's work, of course, filled the latter function. In the oppressive atmosphere of the last 2 decades of the 19th century, artists of all sorts began to see themselves as victimized by society as much as workers were victimized by capital. And this identification with workers led to major contributions to the anarchist press by artists, poets, and novelists. And among the neo-impressionist artists, there was great ideological unanimity. Pissarro, Signac, Luz, Engrand, Cross, Van Rysselberg, for example, all contributed to Les Temps Nouveaux. and almost all were personally acquainted with Grave and Pissarro and Signac. Pissarro and Signac in particular were often opening their wallets and giving money to support the various anarchist publications. So the worlds of art and anarchy merged in the late 19th century because both sought destruction of old forms that would create the conditions for the emergence of full human potential. Neither anarchists nor the avant-garde artists and intellectuals were willing to conform to established traditions and institutions. Their shared nonconformity, their shared desire to escape objectification by the state and by capital, their lust for individual agency and uniqueness, their rejection of bourgeois social myths, a shared sense of victimization, and their burning awareness of social injustice brought artists and anarchists into a shared project based on a common aesthetic. Thinking and living according to one's preferences and understanding often involved a closer relationship with nature. For example, nudism became a fairly widespread practice among anarchists. Reclus spent an hour a day on natural. And he also advocated, as was mentioned earlier, vegetarianism, and this is a preference which continues to be general among anarchists to this day. And with the smashing of the state and the elimination of physical borders, anarchists also welcomed the creation of Esperanto in 1887. Most anarchists rejected marriage as an institution, arguing that neither state nor church had a place in regulating individual choices, and that individuals should be free to enter and exit relations at will. Significantly, anarchists were the only ideological orientation in the 19th century that defended same-sex relationships. Monogamy was rather thoroughly jettisoned. Fénéon, for example, maintained a lifelong relationship with Camille Platil, even after he was married, and his wife was well aware of the relationship, and it continued on throughout his life, or their lives. In each of these areas, anarchists rejected traditional norms, and of course the avant-garde in art was busily rejecting traditional artistic norms. In short, anarchists and artists at the end of the 19th century were thoroughly nonconformist. Pissarro's art both anticipated this ethic and embodied it. Pissarro was completely ensconced in the worlds of art and anarchy, indeed helping to construct the culture that would come to define modernity. He was part of a vast intellectual and social network that energized the late 19th century France, partly because the participants in that culture ardently believed they were midwives to revolution. The sense that the world was on the cusp of a revolution was truly palpable. In our current post-hope condition, it's difficult to fully appreciate the sense of anticipation, the manifest impatience with the past, the yearning for freedom that led many to throw their lives into the struggle. For such an endeavor, a vision of the future is necessary. Drawing on the work of Kropotkin and Reclus and Grave, his favorite writers, Pissarro painted the anarchist future. It was, as Kropotkin predicted, a world in which labor was dignified, human relations horizontal, and needs were amply met without long, arduous hours of coerced work. It was Reclus' ecological paradise where humans and their environment coexisted, where nature would be nurtured by man rather than exploited and despoiled, where landscape was not simply a background, but the vital force shaping and being shaped by man. It was Grave's future, where art was for everyone and everyone an artist. Thanks to Rick Bertel, who's thoroughly uncovered the anarchist narrative in Pissarro's painting, we can now fully appreciate, share, and help build Pissarro's future.